So speaking of jobs that couldn't be done or maybe shouldn't be done, and a gentleman had come up and asked the question about the economic policies in the Nixon administration, including wage and price controls.
John Connally was Secretary of Treasury. He'd been a Democrat, he switched to independent, and then I think he became a Republican. And George Shultz was director of the Office of Management and Budget. And President Nixon was getting criticized for inflation in the country. And so they went up to Camp David and had a big meeting with Dr. Herb Stein and probably Paul McCracken and Marina von Neumann Whitman and these economists. And the next thing you know, John Connally talked President Nixon into imposing wage price controls. He had been at the Treasury and the Congress, to embarrass President Nixon and to be able to say he's not doing anything about inflation, even though he has all the power, they passed this legislation absolutely certain he'd never use it. The legislation got passed. It goes to the president for signature. The Treasury Department staff wrote a long memo explaining why it was a terrible idea to have wage price controls. And John Connally took one look at the memo, and as I discuss in the book, I think he said something to the staff, "You're against this?" And the staff said, "Yeah, it's a terrible idea to have wage price controls." And Big John Connally, former governor of Texas, said, "Look, if the legislature gives you some power, never turn it down. Like an old shotgun, stick it over in the corner. Who knows when you'll need it?" Then he talked Nixon into imposing wage price controls. The next thing I know, George Shultz comes to me and said, "Don, the president and I want you to be in charge of the wage price controls and be director of the economic stabilization program." I said to George, "But I don't believe in wage price controls. I'm sure they'll mess up the markets, and it's simply a bad idea." George said, "I know. That's why we want you to run them."
That's good. So in the Nixon administration, one thing you did was you were totally removed from Watergate. Now, how'd that happen? How was that possible?
We had to keep the wage price controls and the economic programs out of politics. And so I wasn't involved in politics during the 1972 election. And that's when Watergate occurred. It turned out that it wasn't much of an issue in the campaign at all. And Richard Nixon defeated George McGovern. I think he won 49 states out of 50. And he lost Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. And that's all. And then within months, the Watergate thing built and built and built. And by then, I was serving as ambassador to NATO, living over in Brussels. And someone wrote an article and said, "Who's the smartest man in Washington?" And the answer was Don Rumsfeld. And then it said, "But he's not in Washington." And it said, "That's right." so it was just luck. I just happened, the president said, "I think you ought to go over and be ambassador to NATO right after the election," and I did. And I'm forever grateful.
So jumping into the Ford administration, you became the youngest Secretary of Defense.
True.
And you were later in a position to serve as the oldest Secretary of Defense. So my question is, what was the same or different in the Pentagon in those 25 years between when you were there?
Well, I think the thing that was the same is the truly wonderful young men and women that serve in the armed forces of the United States. They were terrific the first time I was there. They're terrific the second time. Thanks to Richard Nixon and Milton Friedman, we have an all-volunteer military, and everyone serving there is serving there because they want to. They raise their hand and say, "I volunteer." And they're patriotic, they're dedicated, they're courageous, and we as a people have to be so deeply grateful to them. And of course, a big difference is that the second time we were at war, and you can't be in those positions and see young men and women going off to serve and get killed or wounded. and visit them and their families in the hospital. Each life is precious, and each death is tragic, and that was a big difference. Another difference of a different order is that when I was secretary the first time in the 70s, the defense authorization bill was 74 pages long. When I came back in 2001, the defense authorization bill was, I think, 570 pages long. And what had happened is there had been an explosion on the staffs in the Congress. And the involvement of the so-called Iron Triangle, the defense contractors, the permanent bureaucracy in the Defense Department, the civilian and military, plus the retired military, and the Congress, those three elements had things the way they want them. And they are entrenched and resistant to change. And of course, the second time I was there, it was a new inflection point. We were at the end of the Cold War. We were moving into the 21st century, the information age, an entirely different environment. We were not threatened by big armies, navies, or air forces. We were threatened by, in the case of 9/11, asymmetric threats and problems where we had to figure out a way to go to war in countries that we weren't at war with, in ungoverned areas, not against nation states, but against networks of terrorists. So that change was dramatic.
So how much of the transformation from the 20th century to the 21st century military were we able to get done? And what's your assessment of how much remains to be done? And where are the biggest sort of friction points?
I think of transformation as probably not the right word. The president gave a speech at the Citadel, President Bush, calling for transforming the Department of Defense and bringing it into the 21st century. He had an agenda, and he wanted to changes in the department, and when he asked me to serve, that's what he wanted me to do. So I came in there not with my agenda, but with his. The process is really more like transforming, because it doesn't begin and end, it's a continuum. The things we've got accomplished, a lot of people said when September 11th came that anything to try to transform the department was dead on arrival. It just wouldn't happen. In fact, the sense of urgency that came with the problems from September 11th and the threats to this country were so great that it actually provided an impetus to change. It gave people in the Congress and in the executive branch and in the industry a sense that, well, maybe we do have to make some adjustments. Just to list 3 or 4 things real quickly. We dramatically increased the special forces in the United States, the Navy SEALs and the Army Special Forces. We got the Marines involved. We increased their numbers. We increased their equipment significantly, and we increased their authorities. And the reason they're doing so well around the world today is because of the effort over that 6-year period. Second, you can't read a paper today without reading about an unmanned aerial vehicle. They're used for a great many things today. We had very, very, very few in 2001. And today, because of a lot of effort and investment, they're saving lives, they're able to monitor things, and doing a terrific job.